Hi there. Are you a defector? You could be. It all depends on how your government or that of your destination sees you. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why? All these factors and more determine whether you fall into this nebulous group or not. Let's dig deeper. What is a defector exactly? Normally, you just go to the dictionary, look up the word, find out it's a noun that means someone who leaves a country, political party, etc., especially in order to join an opposing one, and go on with your day. But it's not that simple. That definition is neutral sounding, but it's coated in ideological baggage. One side's defector is another's refugee, like how one side's terrorist is another's resistance fighter. It's a matter of perspective and what you believe. Let's illustrate this with the German example. You'll find a deeper dive in an older video here. At times, the West likes to style anyone coming out of the Eastern Bloc, in this case from East to West Germany, as a defector fleeing communist persecution, when in reality most of them were economic migrants, regular people in search of a better life, not people seeking to join any opposition, necessarily. A necessary addendum, that doesn't mean East Germany did nothing wrong or that any country is perfect. There were serious political, economic, social, and other shortcomings. Innocent people were at times surveilled, others imprisoned. Not nearly as much as happens in the modern US or EU, but that's a conversation on perspective that we can bother with at another time, or by watching this video here. Otherwise, refer to the book recommendations at the end of the video. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom depends on privacy, but in the US, that privacy is under threat. Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act was meant for spying on foreign targets, yet it's routinely used to sweep up Americans' data too. And it's not just the NSA. The FBI and even local police can sidestep warrants by buying personal info from shady data brokers. That means your emails, texts, and calls are all at risk. That's why you need Proton Mail. Proton is privacy first by design. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's shielded by some of the world's strongest privacy laws, which prevents foreign governments from forcing Proton to hand over your data, and thanks to end-to-end encryption, your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers, so not even Proton can read them. Use the link in the description to get Proton's first encrypted email service and take back control of your digital life. And Proton isn't just email. With Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar, your files, passwords, and schedules all benefit from the same zero-access encryption. In a world where governments and corporations are always looking for ways into your data, privacy shouldn't be optional. It should be the default. If you use Proton VPN, you can also shield your browsing history from ad tech and data brokers. And with Proton's feature Easy Switch, or even import your messages, calendars, and contacts all in one click. Join over 100 million people who have already taken back their privacy with Proton. Get started for free at proton.me/Hakeem or by clicking the link in the description. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Before the Berlin Wall was built, East Germany saw 2.5 million citizens emigrate to the West between 1949 and 1961. This caused serious problems for the GDR in terms of labor shortages and brain drain. There were many reasons why someone left, especially in the early period, up to the early 50s, from uncomfortable Nazi connections pre-defeat in 1945 to standing to lose too much financially from the change in socioeconomic system. The people who left after this early period, on the other hand, were provided a world-class education and vocational schooling, such that by the end of the 1980s, 95% of students attended schools that provided them a 10-year school-leaving certificate, basically the equivalent of an American high school diploma. Comparatively, in the modern US, the percentage of high school graduates hovers around the mid-80s, and this figure was even lower in the 1980s. A significant amount of those Germans would continue on to university. Since all of that was provided to students for free, it represents a significant investment, one which they expect a return in the form of productive labor contributed to that society, as do nearly all societies. If that person emigrates, that investment and experience is lost and another country will reap the benefit. In short, labor loss and brain drain. From this perspective, it's not hard to understand why most nations generally discourage or make it hard to immigrate, and is part of why the GDR commissioned the building of the 155-kilometer Berlin Wall in 1961, amongst other reasons. It could have also been because of the strange experimentation happening in West Germany with the full approval of the state, like the example of the Kentler Project, where mentally challenged or otherwise neglected children were placed in the care of pedophiles. Pause and read the following if you're interested. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, this really isn't the reason that the Berlin Wall was put up, but it is a fairly good one. 19th century colonialism is best known for creating the structural disadvantages for the global south they suffer under today. They did this by forcibly organizing local economies to extract wealth through straight-up plunder and violent exploitation. The result was underdeveloped, poor regions by preventing any self-determination or uniform economic development. To this day, capital is being extracted to feed industrial production, repatriating profits from this periphery to the imperial core. Skipping over a lot of detail, this eventually evolved into modern neocolonial mechanisms. transnational corporations have come to dominate key sectors in the global south. The IMF and World Bank, extensions of US foreign policy and capital interest for the most part, control access to essential credit and debt restructuring that drains even more capital from the global south. The resulting economic distortion prioritizes raw material exports and imposes systems that deliberately block self-determined development or uniform industrialization. If you want a deeper dive into unequal exchange, I've made relevant videos on it here. The poverty this creates drives migration by displacing people from low to high wage areas, a pattern institutionalized through colonial cyclical migration, where workers scrape by through subsistence farming, then supply cheap labor across borders without their families. As was the case in the mid-1950s, when approximately 50% of adult African men in Mozambique were employed away from their homes for part of the year, while, at the same time, 2/3 of South African miners came from other countries. In the modern era, most, for example, doctors from Malawi, work outside of Malawi. This is the mechanism that drives people to wealthier countries in the industrialized West all the time, a heritage of colonialism that results in millions of defectors from the raw face of capitalism every single year. Eastern Bloc nations faced similar challenges, mostly because of economic sanctions or sabotage. Despite this, the vast majority of socialist countries provided a better quality of life than countries at similar levels of economic development, with some relevant videos on that here. After World War I, the Russian Revolution, and Civil War, the Soviet state began managing migration. Aristocrats and bourgeois emigres left while hundreds of communist intellectuals and thousands of Western workers arrived to help build this new society. Soviet policy emphasized revolutionary solidarity and security, keeping immigration open on internationalist and not purely economic grounds. By the early 1920s and early 1930s, these policies offered many foreigners an alternative to the collapsing capitalist system. The economic conditions facing the American working class during most of the 1930s were absolutely abysmal. Following the 1929 stock market crash, unemployment reached unprecedented levels of at least 25%, 13 million Americans deprived of livelihood. This was visible across the country as makeshift settlements known as Hoovervilles, while millions stood in seemingly endless bread lines and packed soup kitchens to survive. Unsurprisingly, many workers began looking elsewhere for opportunities to support themselves and their families. So many people left the US that, for the first and only time in its history, there was a net negative migration, more people leaving than entering the US. Between January and August 1931 alone, Amtorg, the Soviet Union's trade agency, received over 100,000 emigration applications from Americans who represented a wide cross-section of American technical expertise: engineers, industrial workers, teachers, and agricultural specialists. This is proof of just how popular socialism was at this time in America. Hundreds of thousands of people were comfortable expressing their interest in emigrating to the USSR and actually doing it. The arriving specialists encountered a society undergoing rapid transformation. Between 20 and 150 American technicians arrived daily at Moscow's Belaruski station, including miners from multiple states, steelworkers from industrial centers, and various skilled tradespeople. The enthusiastic response initially created logistical challenges, with housing shortages in major cities already experiencing population growth from internal migration. Even amid those pressures, the city's international community quickly mobilized a suit for cultural and educational resources to help them settle and become productive members of Soviet society. A newspaper which already served as a hub for foreign correspondents organized intensive Russian language classes for all newcomers, covering everything from basic conversational skills to specialized terminology for engineers, miners, and factory workers, ensuring that these technicians could read technical manuals, attend meetings, and navigate bureaucratic procedures. Additionally, Soviet radio launched a parallel program of English language broadcasts that featured lessons on Soviet political and economic policy, explanations of the 5-year plan's objectives, and cultural segments that introduced listeners to American customs, encouraging a two-way flow of cultural exchange of sorts. Back to East Germany, they conceived of and built the Berlin Wall as a defensive response to what is characterized as sustained Western economic warfare, espionage, and military provocation. Since this is from East Germany's perspective, I'll be using the German abbreviations DDR. Historical context is critical. The DDR was created in October 1949 as a direct response to the West's surprise introduction of a separate currency in the summer and the creation of the Federal Republic in September. The Federal Republic of Germany initiated a steel export embargo in 1950, followed by a complete ban on intra-German East-West trade in 1951, including anthracite coal, upon which the DDR was heavily reliant, in a deliberate attempt to severely stunt its economic development. Despite all of this, and contrary to Western Red Scare propaganda, the DDR built a remarkable society. It carried out an actual denazification process, in stark contrast to the West, where many Nazis simply swapped their swastika for a black eagle and continued to occupy influential government positions. The DDR also changed the learning process and curricula to overcome extreme inequity in education, as well as entrenched class, gender, and urban-rural conflicts. A fully comprehensive school system with a national curriculum was created that abolished the old grammar school system that favored elites. The vast majority of children completed 10 years of schooling, and every student who graduated from the school was offered apprenticeship training. Special worker and farmer faculties provided access to courses for those without basic qualifications. School books were free or heavily subsidized. All university students received grants and heavily subsidized accommodation, which fostered a more egalitarian society with much less wealth disparity. This polytechnical education linked schools and workplaces and strengthened the sense of community by having them be interconnected. Of course, the Constitution guaranteed free healthcare, including dentistry and medication, as well as employment and affordable housing. However, the ruling circles of West Germany, whose so-called miraculous economic rise was substantially fueled by an influx of highly skilled labor from the East, could not tolerate the existence of a socialist state. Their official policy was the eventual annexation of the DDR, and the intensity of the efforts to disrupt it are indicative of that. The leaders of West Berlin have said they want to be the disturber of peace, a poorly veiled threat, while the mayor, Willy Brandt, said that West Berlin was meant to be a thorn in the side of the DDR. They backed up that rhetoric by becoming a center of provocation, harboring many espionage organizations planning and carrying out the sabotage campaigns that targeted DDR residents working in West Berlin, which required a governmental response. Broadly speaking, this is called brain drain, and its economic consequences for the DDR were catastrophic. Between 1949 and 1961, as mentioned, more than 2.5 million citizens left. Annual losses rose from 143,000 in 1959 to 199,000 in 1960. That year also saw nearly 700 doctors, 300 dentists, and over 2,600 engineers depart, costing roughly 3.5 billion marks at the time. DDR propaganda of the era framed these departures as an act of political and moral depravity. The reality, however, was classic economic migrants attracted by higher salaries and consumer goods for a better material life. Border crossers expected favorable conditions, but really just ended up working as cheap labor in West Berlin during construction seasons and eventually returning to the DDR during winter. West Berlin further facilitated massive smuggling and currency manipulation against the DDR, usually in cash, cigarettes, jewelry hid in children's backpacks or clothing, amongst other things. As a result, in August of 1961, the DDR implemented strict supervision and controls along the 155-kilometer border to West Berlin. They established observation towers while border roads were more frequently patrolled. There was an immediate economic impact hit to the West afterwards, where armament company shares fell sharply, and that exploitative exchange rate mentioned earlier collapsed. Unfortunately, the wall didn't have any effect on the West's hostile policies, though. It did, however, allow the DDR to stabilize its economy and continue peaceful development. It contained espionage centers, fascist soldiers associations, and currency racketeers. Travel restrictions were in place, in part due to a critical shortage of foreign currency and further brain drain that I discussed earlier. Nevertheless, between 1961 and 1989, the DDR did grant official permission for more than 430,000 people to move to the West. Some people did try to cross over illegally, and some tragically ended up dying in the process. As much of a tragedy as that is, though, more people die every single year at the US-Mexican border than died at the Berlin Wall for its entire history. That fact, though, isn't widely known because it isn't ideologically convenient the way the Berlin Wall is. The USSR and DDR were the examples I used in this video, but this applies across the Warsaw Pact in general. The strict immigration limits had their reasoning, and the majority of it made sense, at least for those countries. All countries want to retain their citizens because without a people, a country is just a bunch of land. The US stands out because it is a settler colonial nation built on immigration at the expense of Native Americans, a nation with a chronic labor shortage until fairly recently, hence the issue with borders and illegal immigrants the past 2 decades or so. As mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union allowed modest outflows between 1917 and 1922, but soon imposed near total bans on both emigration and immigration. At the same time, the USSR nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, and implemented central planning as it was technologically behind by at least a century and needed to catch up. While this isn't the only reason that ban was implemented, it is one of the easiest to illustrate. It's hard to show, for example, the concerns Gorbachev had about brain drain, even though he explicitly linked the policy to retaining skilled personnel. Even during the limited liberalizations of the 1960s and 1970s, the state imposed financial penalties. University-educated immigrants repaid their education, and a citizenship renunciation fee was tenfold higher for moves to capitalist countries than to socialist countries, 500 to 50 rubles. In the US, doing the same would cost you around $2,350, so Americans don't really stand on better ground regarding this. Immigration to the USSR was equally restricted and permitted on a case-by-case basis, rather than via quotas. For many decades, immigration remained negligible, save for certain Kremlin-negotiated intra-USSR resettlements. Geopolitical and security concerns, not economic needs, drove that policy after World War II. In fact, foreign workers only comprised 0.05% of the Soviet labor force by 1977. One exception to this rule was employing temporary workers from socialist allies who were assigned to specific projects and paid in cash directly to their home governments. Roughly 700,000 of them worked in Moscow from 1971 and 1986. After 4 years, some workers could obtain permanent status, but the process was opaque. This is arguably marginally better than America with its long history of racist and politically motivated immigration policies that sought, and seek to this day, to exploit the desperate people looking for a better life, only to deny them when it's convenient, as is the case with ICE. Besides the arduous and long process to become a US citizen, the US also denies passports to Communist Party members, or affiliation, which could mean anything, basically banning them from leaving the country, while at the same time clamoring for immigrants from socialist states during the Cold War to exploit for Red Scare propaganda. They would do this while rejecting economic migrants from capitalist countries like Haiti. It's an ideology game, you see. Western Europe too actively recruited labor via agreements imposed on former colonies and Mediterranean nations, which peaked in the early 1970s, bringing in over 20 million migrants. Though economically beneficial, these migrants often faced limited naturalization or integration, keeping them politically marginal. Comparable migration controls existed elsewhere. As early as the 17th century, Britain required royal exit licenses, a passport of sorts you could say, for politically loyal or financially secure travelers. China's immigration ban until 1894 was weakened by one of the many unequal treaties, while post-revolution restrictions have been aimed to protect citizens and conserve labor, along the same thought path as the DDR and the USSR. It's important to note here that China's experience of the century of humiliation kickstarted by the British provides us with a good example of the type of thing the USSR and others were trying to avoid: domination and exploitation at the hands of capitalist powers. Who is called a defector depends on who is writing the story. Whether people jumped the Berlin Wall, fled to the Soviet Union, or risked their lives in rough seas to cross from Libya to Italy, it's usually to seek a better economic life. Yes, there were some people who moved to countries for political reasons, and the destination country was happy for that propaganda boost. But most weren't and most aren't. Today, migration is being falsely portrayed as an invasion in the US, a major crisis in Europe, despite massively benefiting from it. Neither of these give an accurate picture of what's happening, and both are being used to enact far-right policies up to ICE kidnappings right off the street. It's important to keep in mind that ideology shapes words, and you need to notice these patterns to not be manipulated into a particular way of thinking. This doesn't mean that limiting immigration or emigration is necessarily good. It doesn't mean that the way that former socialist countries did it was the correct way of doing things, so on and so forth. But there was context to all of this, and it's at least beneficial to know it before we comment on it. A few books to recommend: The Stasi State or Socialist Paradise, which covers everything East Germany related. I cannot recommend this book enough. The Triumph of Evil by Austin Murphy also has a fairly in-depth overview of the East German example, which I likewise recommend. And Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union, which covers the immigration point in plenty of detail as well. There's more to recommend, but I think that's enough for now. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.